Thank you, everyone. Some of you are already familiar with the concept of agonistic memory, not least because I spoke about it in Bath. So as you heard from David Clark, this concept is supposed to some extent to inform the DisTerrMem project as it informed the Unrest project. I would like to say that the concept is not written in stone by any means, and in fact it was both problematized and enriched during the course of the Unrest project, and this may well happen during the course of the DisTerrMem project. So just to say, first of all, that the concept of agonistic memory, as David has already said, draws on Chantal Mouffe's theory of agonistic democracy. Now, one of you yesterday very rightly pointed out that there is, if you like, a bias in the theory, because Chantal Mouffe, to some extent, takes for granted that agonism, the setting for agonism is a liberal democracy. And so the question was, you know, what happens when we're talking about societies which are not liberal democracies? So Chantal Mouffe has not dealt with this extensively, but she has referred to such societies. And what she argued was that, in fact, and I'll quote from her, some people will say that the aim is to create a consensus in societies emerging from a bloody conflict. But this is not possible, she says, because the demands are incompatible. What is possible is for that confrontation to take a form that is agonistic, which would mean that there is a possibility of life in common. So I'll come back to that later. So moving on then to the concept of agonistic memory. This concept was first put forward by myself and my colleague from Denmark, Hans Hansen. We collaborated together, and we published this article in 2016 in Memory Studies. And basically, we argued that there exist only three main modes of remembering. That is to say that we remember the past in three distinct ways, and we can, to a large extent, describe the traits, the different traits of those modes. So the first way we remember the past is through antagonistic lenses. And what does this mean? This means that we remember the past in terms of a moral struggle between essentialized collective identities. And we conceive the other as an enemy to be destroyed. Now, that can mean that the enemy has to be destroyed physically through bloody violence, but it can also mean, as if you take the example of Italy, for instance, with the rhetoric about refugees and migrants, it can simply mean that the enemy has to be expelled from the country and eliminated in that way. Cosmopolitan memory represents the past also as a moral struggle, but it's a moral struggle between abstract systems, for instance, between democracy and dictatorship. And this memory mode is able to reach out to the other through the prism of victimhood. So we've all suffered through history. We suffered because of wars, because of conflicts, because of dictatorships, and therefore we can all sympathize with the other and reach out through our common suffering. The third memory mode that we postulated in that article represents the past not in moral terms, but as a social political struggle for hegemony, in which the other should be viewed as an adversary. So we recognize that society is conflictual, that conflict is an ineradicable part of social relations. But what we should strive to do, and here obviously we follow Chantal Mouffe, is to view the other as an adversary and potentially, in some circumstances, also as an ally. So here I've reproduced the table that was part of the article that was published, and we try to define the main traits of the three memory modes. Obviously, these are ideal types. We don't find the three memory modes so clearly distinguished in reality. So please bear that in mind. But what I want to say here is that we found some other aspects, important aspects, that distinguish between these three ways of remembering. And one of these aspects relates to multi-perspectivity, and other aspects to reflexivity. So is a particular memory mode reflexive and self-reflexive when it looks at the past, and also the relationship to dialogue. Is a particular memory mode open to dialogue with the other or not, and how does it conceive such a dialogue? And that's important because dialogue is usually a key element of reconciliation practices as well as memory. So I'll talk about this now. So starting with the reflexivity and multi-perspectivity. So is antagonistic memory reflexive and multi-perspective? No, the answer is no, because antagonistic memory views societies in the past and in the present as divided between us and them, and us is usually good and them is usually evil, and therefore they cannot be reflective. And also they cannot reflect on the constructed nature of identities because they don't believe that identities are constructive. So following a book by Bernhard and Kubik, who wrote about memory practices, memory approaches in Eastern Europe, these antagonistic memory agents can be defined as mnemonic warriors. And I quote from that book, mnemonic warriors tend to espouse a single, unidirectional, mythological vision of time. The alternative visions of the past, by definition distorted, need to be delegitimized and destroyed. It's only one vision of the past that has to become dominant. Turning to cosmopolitan memory agents, and again following the definitions put forward in that book that I found quite useful in many ways. So cosmopolitan memory agents can be defined as mnemonic pluralists. And again, I quote, mnemonic pluralists accept that in addition to us and our vision of history, there are them with their vision of the past. Most important, the pluralists believe that the others are entitled to their vision. However, because cosmopolitans view the past through the prism of victimhood, then there is a limit to how pluralist they are. They usually do not incorporate the perspectives of the perpetrators, for example. And for agonists, that is a mistake. So if we continue with that kind of definition, we could define agonistic memory agents as radical mnemonic pluralists, in the sense that they want to open up to incorporate the perspectives also of perpetrators, of traitors, of bystanders, of very, if you like, undesirable figures. And why should that be done? Why should we incorporate their perspectives? Not in order to justify their deeds, but in order to understand how people become perpetrators, how people turn to bloody conflict. And if we don't understand that, there is no cosmopolitan approach that can prevent the return of conflict. So, what is the role of memory in post-conflict societies? We know that it is considered both pivotal, is key, but is also controversial. So, as Who is argued in 2013, and I quote, Memory is a two-edged sword. It can play a crucial role in making reconciliation sustainable, but it also has the capacity to hinder reconciliation processes. So if we take the second part of this argument, then the best strategy to deal with the past is simply to forget about it. And this is a strategy that is promoted by certain scholars in reconciliation and transitional justice literature. And of course, it's what was done in Spain after the death of Franco, when the parties agreed on the famous Pact of Forgetting. However, I would say that it may work in the short term, but precisely as the example of Spain shows, it doesn't work in the longer term, because many people and memory agents will challenge that and will want to reopen the debate on the past. A second strategy wants to promote remembering, but in a very cosmopolitan way. So I quote from Brewer with reference to Northern Ireland, who wrote that what was needed was recasting social memory as a peace strategy. So we got to remember, but we got to remember the suffering of the victims on all sides, etc. A very cosmopolitan approach. But if we want to adopt an agonistic approach, then we don't ignore the contrasting and divisive memories of the past. We have to find ways of dealing with them. So that would be the third approach. So what are these strategies? What strategies can we adopt for transforming antagonism into agonism through memory? This is not supposed to be a definitive list. It's a list of strategies that has emerged largely from the Unrest project, so it's not just theoretical. It came about from as a result of our empirical research. So one way, an important way, is to incorporate contrasting narratives and viewpoints. Also, disrupting binary representations of us versus them, because that is the problem. Usually in conflict situations, and we've already seen with antagonism, you have this clear-cut division into us and them. And one way in which it could be done is to try and remember struggles and alliances that cut across this binary division. And one way in which was done, for instance, one example is through an exhibition that was prepared in Belfast at the Ulster Museum as a collaboration between curators and academics. The exhibition was about 1968 in Northern Ireland. So what it did, it was to remember a period before the bloody conflict in which it was not a period of consensual agreement. It was a period in which there were many protests, mass protests, struggles, demands for rights, for instance, gender equality, etc., but they were not violent. So it's important to remember the past not in utopistic terms, as a past where there was a perfect consensus. It is absolutely vital to remember the struggles of the past by, as I said, cutting across the binary divide. Promoting agonistic dialogue. It seems to me that in the literature on reconciliation and transitional justice, there is now an increasing attention to the concept of agonistic dialogue. So this is the idea that you promote a dialogue not aiming at consensus, but you accept that the dialogue is open-ended. It may not end in agreement, and it may not end with an overarching consensual narrative. And nonetheless, that dialogue is important. So I like there is especially one scholar called Madison who has written quite a lot about the form that agonistic dialogue, the shape that it could take. So that may be interesting. Another strategy would be to constantly show and reveal the social political struggles around hegemony in the past and in the present, but also show how perspectives change over time. So in my own research on the legacy and memory of Italian terrorism, I was really interested in this dialogue that took place between 2009 and 2014 between former terrorists and victims of terrorism. And what was interesting for me, and in the end, at the end of the dialogue, they published a joint book. And what was interesting for me was the fact that the mediators, the promoters of the dialogue, said at the beginning they thought that they might reach a shared vision of the past, a shared memory of the past, and very soon they realized that that was impossible. And so they accepted that all they could do was to create a shared space in which contested memories of the past could confront each other in a constructive way. And also what was interesting to me was to see how for many former terrorists reflecting upon the past and what they did in the past did not, on the one hand, totally rejected what they had done, especially the ideals, but they reject the violent path that they had taken, and they accepted that they could have tried and achieved those aims in different ways, not through violence. Okay. Another way is to understand the motivations and context underpinning both perpetratorship and victimhood. I've already mentioned this. And passions. It's important to deal with passions, reveal the passions leading to violent conflict. We know how important passions are, rage, anger, hatred. They play a big part in turning to violence. But also, it's important to understand and sustain and promote the passions that can foster democratic institutions and processes. So we need to understand much more about the role of passions. We should not believe that simply we put passions to one side and we deal with a situation just rationally, because it won't work. Okay, so briefly, what did we learn from the Arrest project? And I wanted to focus not on the museum case study, because I know already yesterday there were hints as if quite rightly people said, okay, but it's fairly easy in a relatively safe environment like a museum to try and promote agonism. You try and do it in a situation in which the memory is raw and there are real passions at play. But we had another case study in the Arrest project, and it was a case study in which passions were very raw and the memory was very present, the memory of the conflict. And this was mass grave exhumations. So the case study was quite complex because it involved 3 countries, Spain, Poland, and Bosnia. And in each country there were 3 sites that were analyzed, 3 mass grave sites. So what did we learn from this particular case study in the relation to agonism? We learned, first of all, that in a social context, not in a museum, not in a cultural context, but in a social context, agonism is largely relational. And it develops, in other words, you have the interplay of memory groups and memory agents, and they don't need to adopt necessarily an agonistic mode in order to challenge a hegemonic memory regime. So in Spain, for instance, at the time when forgetting was the dominant memory regime, there were victims' associations, particularly the the Association for the Recovery of Historical Memory, which adopted a very cosmopolitan type of approach, and they used the discourse of human rights in order to reopen the issue of the past conflict, in order to be allowed to exhumate the graves, the mass graves of the Republican victims. And so this was very contentious at the time, but they managed to link up with international organizations, and they were successful in challenging forgetting. So obviously, yes, cosmopolitan, for instance, a cosmopolitan approach can be useful, can be successful, and that's important to recognize. But also what happened in Spain, it seemed to us, was that once it became hegemonic itself, this cosmopolitan approach started to, in a sense, prevent a further opening of space for debate and contestation. So almost as if, their position was, we have the right approach, we have the right solution, and we don't want to be challenged. So that is a problem for cosmopolitanism. I think agonists must also be very careful in allowing a continuation of debate and contestation. And then what emerged from the case study was, which I thought was very important, was this, the fact that cosmopolitanism can be twisted and it can be put to the service of antagonistic relations. So I have a quotation here from our colleagues from Unrest, Ristova and Ferrandis, and they argued in 2019, they wrote, in Poland, nationalist and antagonistic memory frames are dressed in the cosmopolitan attire of victimhood and new human rights. In Bosnia, cosmopolitanism has been imported by the international NGOs, but it has been readily incorporated into the local dynamics of ethnic antagonism. So basically, you can have situations in which you have a cosmopolitan discourse, but in fact, you have a very antagonistic type of situation. And when you reach that impasse, it may be difficult to overcome it. And that's when, again, switching to agonism, or at least trying to promote agonistic interventions, can help to overcome the impasse. Okay, so when should we apply agonistic memory? So from what I've said, I hope I have made clear that it's not a, take it or leave it. It's not a theory that is simply, it's a toolkit that, okay, here we have a difficult situation, let's apply agonism, all problems solved. Obviously, it's not like that, and we do recognize that there are risks in introducing agonistic approaches. So in cases of extreme antagonistic confrontation, we recognize that we have to be cautious, but still there are certain interventions that we would favor. And one of them certainly is to reflect and to expose as much as possible the socially constructed nature of cultural memory, the socially constructed nature of ethnic and other identities. Recognize the other as a human being. Now, we all know that when you view the other as an enemy, you go through a process of dehumanization. You have to rehumanize the enemy. But you don't rehumanize the enemy as a positive human being only, but as positive and negative. So I was at the Memory Studies Association conference in Madrid in June, and there was this keynote speech by Viet Thanh Nguyen, this novelist, and as he put it, what we should aim at is to recognize that both us and them are human beings with good and bad traits. Now, this seems really easy, but as he explained, and he's written novels on Vietnam especially, as he explained, actually what happens is not that. What happens is we view ourselves as good, the others as bad, us and them as good, or us and them as bad, or even us as bad and them as good. But never that what he suggested. Okay, and then obviously we also need to respect basic human rights. So in more settled cases, we can go much further, and that's why it depends on context. The theory is not just, that you apply it indiscriminately to every context. You have to be sensitive, very sensitive to context. All of you know the context in which you operate, so you will know what you can or you cannot do. But certainly, in more settled case, there should be a willingness to question pre-established narrative templates and hegemonic understandings of the past, an openness to question moral labels such as victims and perpetrators. We know very well that victims often are also perpetrators and vice versa. And so we need to open to that. Willingness to consider not only the differences between groups, but within groups. Again, cut across is the whole point of trying to cut across essentialist collective identity. So I'm coming to the end. So the idea is to create, the aim is to reach a conflictual consensus. So consensus about the forum, but dissent concerning values and points of view. And this, so heritage institutions and memory spaces, for instance, in post-conflict societies, should permit the interaction of contested perspectives within a negotiated legal and political frame of dissent. Difficult to achieve, I agree. So it may only be possible to inject agonistic elements into cosmopolitan practices rather than go straight for agonism. But I wanted to say something very briefly about agents, because you may ask, but who are the agents who are supposed to be doing all this? So, well, David and I recently published an article, and we did recognize that, and we wrote, it is difficult to envisage either the international or the state level switching to promoting an approach that deliberately forgoes closure in favor of ongoing contestation and acknowledges the need for material as well as symbolic reparations for past injustices without the concerted efforts of a diverse coalition of socio-political and cultural agents. So basically, there is a coalition of memory agents that needs to be constructed, created, put together in different contexts. But to go back to our case study, and here I end, of mass graves and cemeteries, actually our colleagues, Ristova and Ferrandis, they came to the conclusion that they constitute spaces with great agonistic potential, even though you may think, don't go there, don't try agonism where there are contested mass grave exhumations. But they say that the passionate involvement of the victims' relatives interacting with the strategies of memory activists and political agents can give rise to agonistic coalitions and practices. So I end there.